Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting addition to Western civilization. Today, we're going to be looking at early Greece. And we're going to be looking at it from the period from 1400 to 500 BC. So grab a pen and paper, a tablet and a keyboard, and let's begin. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to analyze how Greece's mountainous terrain and maritime connections shaped the development of independent city-states and trade networks. Contrast the centralized palace economies of the Bronze Age with the decentralized, citizen-led governance of the polis in the Archaic Age. Evaluate how the rise of hoplite warfare transformed Greek society by empowering citizen soldiers and challenging aristocratic dominance. Explain how public spaces like the Agora and shared traditions such as festival and the Olympics reinforce civic identity and political participation. And trace the evolution of Greek political systems from aristocratic rule to early democracy, highlighting the impact of economic pressures, tyranny, and key reforms. So let's get going. This lecture marks a bit of a transition. We're going to, temporarily at least, leave behind the Near East. For the last couple of lectures, we've been looking at how centralized, powerful kings, with their bureaucracies and hierarchical control, dominated these governments. Here we saw religion and government closely intertwined, as many of these rulers claimed divine sanction or powers. And we saw powerful religious institutions control vast tracts of wealth, land, and reinforce hierarchical rule. As we turn to Greece, we will see that there is no powerful priestly class here, that religion was public and civic in nature, and that authority would rest in councils, assemblies, and citizens. And instead of great empires led by divine kings, we would have a decentralized system of independent city-states. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the birth of the polis. And the polis is going to really be the center of Greek life. We're going to examine how geography shaped Greek politics and how the polis emerged as a new community form out of this geography. We'll see the military and political innovations that led to these new forms of government and lay the foundations for the classical age, which we'll look at in our next lecture. First of all, let's orient ourselves and see exactly where we are. This big body of water here is going to be the Mediterranean, and this is the Eastern Mediterranean over here. And so we have the lands of the Levant, Israel, where we just were. We have the Nile River here in Egypt, and we have the Tigris and Euphrates here on the right side of the map. And if we follow that up, we are in Asia Minor over here, which is just across the just across the sea, I should say, over to Greece. So Greece is going to be located in southeastern Europe. Now, if we look at the Greek terrain, it tells us a lot about how Greek society was going to develop. As you examine these landforms, I want you to notice just how rocky and mountainous Greece is. There are a few large rivers, and open plains and flat areas are relatively rare. Now, we've mentioned it before, but when we have areas that are mountainous, they often act as boundaries. And this is going to be the case in Greece. Except when you have a whole country that consists of mountains and valleys, it's going to act as boundaries within the country. And so Greece is never going to be successfully united. The land doesn't really lend itself to centralized rule. But what it does lend itself to are small, scattered communities. And that's how the Greeks are going to develop. And so they're going to be very distinct from Mesopotamia and Egypt, which are on these big, flat, fertile river valleys with a river that acts as a highway. Greece is never going to have this type of unified government. And so this is the first major geographical feature I'd like you to be aware of. The second, though, is that Greece is going to be a maritime place. It's going to be they're going to be a seafaring people. From the earliest days, trade, travel, and interaction are often easier by sea. You're never really that far away from the ocean when you're in Greece, and for many communities, they find it easier to communicate via water. Furthermore, Greece's mountainous terrain means that it's not going to have the best farmland. And feeding its ever-burgeoning population is going to be a constant struggle for the Greeks. And so shipping is going to be a type of a lifeline. Shipping is going to be, they're often going to trade and import food from other places. They'll become a commercial type of people. And of course, along with trade, the Mediterranean is a big highway of trade, so to speak. But along with trade are going to come many ideas. And the Greeks are going to use this to import foreign ideas and also export their own ideas and identity around the Mediterranean region. And so these two factors, the mountains, which bring isolation, and the sea, which bring connections, are going to be the two poles that Greece is going to develop around. It's going to develop into these small, independent communities, and a Greek territorial state will just never exist. Each community will be largely free from other communities, and they'll be able to experiment with their own forms of government. And many of these are going to center around citizenship and participation. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves. Let's trace Greece back to its earliest civilizations. And so, Bronze Age Greece produced two distinct civilizations. The first is Minoan civilization. And we've mentioned the Minoans before. We mentioned them in the late Bronze Age lecture because the Minoans located on Crete were closely intertwined into the Bronze Age world and were particularly tightly connected with the Egyptians, the Hittites, and also the cities of the Levant. And so the Minoans would engage in long-distance trade. They were a seafaring people themselves. And the Minoans developed, like many Bronze Age civilizations, around a palace economy. We've mentioned the palace economy quite a few times. It's very prevalent in the Bronze Age. Powerful kings would dominate the countryside, and they would monopolize important resources. Their palaces would be workshops and storage facilities. And so we've seen this before. But one of the things that distinguishes Minoan society is that, as you can see from this picture, there are no walls around the palace. And this leads us to believe that the Minoans were a rather peaceful people. They didn't fear attack from others. Probably their navy protected them from attack. And so the kings of Minoa didn't feel like they needed to spend a lot of resources fortifying their palaces. We can also see the art of the Minoans. It's kind of a colorful art form, somewhat inspired by the Egyptians. And the impression that one's left with is a people who enjoyed leisure, who practiced their religious rituals, and who seem to have had a vibrant culture. Unfortunately for the Minoans, by about 1450, their civilization was coming to an end. Again, the details are a little bit murky, but it seems like a combination of natural disasters, in this case, earthquake and tsunami, and also the rise of the next group of people we're going to look at, and these are the Mycenaeans. And so the Mycenaeans are going to be located on the Greek mainland, and they emerge just as the Minoans are weakened. They seem to have been inspired in many ways by the Minoans, and probably are partially responsible for destroying their civilization. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were a warlike people. So we can see the Mycenaean palaces are heavily fortified. They engage in similar Bronze Age activities, centralized palace structure, like we've seen. They seem to have been great craftsmen. We can see some of their metalworking here. This is a Mycenaean sword. You can see the intricate carvings on it. And this elite seemed to be an aristocratic warrior elite in the model of the Homeric epics, if you're familiar with it. You may have heard of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in many ways, the Iliad and the Odyssey, though written later, reflect this world. Aristocrats vied with each other for honor. They engaged in individual combat to show their prowess. And they seem to have been a type of elite, oftentimes buried with large caches of gold and weapons. And much of the art from this civilization is related to scenes of war. And so, again, we see this typical Bronze Age structure where the king is monopolizing and dominating the surrounding peasantry and storing his resources up. Well, like the Minoans, the Mycenaean civilization also collapsed. And its collapse seems to have been part of that larger Bronze Age collapse that we've seen, led by the Sea Peoples. And again, like I said in that lecture, the details are a little bit vague. And so it seems like in the case of the Mycenaeans, there was probably some internal strife among the warring city-states, and then faced with some sort of an external invasion. These palaces began to collapse, and this ushered in what we call the Greek Dark Ages. And so this was a time of population decline. The palaces were all sacked and burned. Their economies failed. The amount of trade goods drops off sharply. The population became de-urbanized, so it became much more rural and smaller. And the Greeks also lost the ability to write. So whatever scribes there were either died or they just didn't have the resources to pass on these skills. And so Greece really got knocked down pretty hard in this period. And so the Dark Ages of Greece represent both a time of crisis, but also of transformation. And it's going to lay the foundation for later Greek society. And so, as we said, the palaces were destroyed and that centralized palace-dominated economy failed, but that wasn't really terrible for everybody. What we start to see replace it are individuals who own their own land. And so, if you're a farmer, it might not have been the worst thing in the world that the palace wasn't around anymore to siphon off your food. You became a small landowner of yourself. You were given a greater amount of personal autonomy and a measure of economic freedom. And this would be important for later development because Greece, unlike, let's say, Egypt or Mesopotamia, is going to be a land where most people own their own farms. And this gives them some resources. We also see fragmentation occur politically, and the kings of the earlier age disappear, and what replaces them is a type of warrior elite. And they dominate the scattered rural communities that are still around. Because there is no monarch to organize them, oftentimes they begin to meet in councils. And this will be the precursor to some of the Greek forms of government that we see developing in later times. Even from this early Dark Age time, these elite Greek warriors are meeting in council and discussing things. On the downside, though, with a lack of authority, the aristocrats themselves, as we'll call them, often engaged in raid and conflict. And so these aristocrats would band together and they would try to win prestige by feats of combat, and they would try to acquire wealth through plunder and engage in all sorts of combat on an individual small scale. During these dark times, culture survived mostly in oral form. So this would have been the age of the great poets like Homer, if he existed. There's a bit of a debate whether he was a real person or a composite. But this would have been the time when the Iliad and the Odyssey, those two great Greek epics, were first put into verse. And in these epics, Homer and other Greek poets laid out some of the most important ideas that would dominate the Dark Ages, but also become important Greek ideas of themselves. And the first of these that I want to talk about is the idea of arete. That's A-R-E-T-E. And arete means excellence. And this was a very important idea for the Greek aristocracy. Unlike in the days of the Mycenaean kings, where maybe you could get your honor through working in the bureaucracy or serving a king, in these days, to have honor, you had to win it for yourself. You needed to prove yourself. You needed to show that you were excellent. And that would happen mostly through hand-to-hand combat. These are warriors, after all. And so these Greek aristocrats, or aristoi as they're called in Greek, were very, very competitive. And so this is another important factor about Greek identity that forms during these times. The Greeks have what is called an agonal impulse. And agonal, which is actually an English word, but comes from Greek, means this desire to compete. We get the word agony from it, believe it or not. But it means this desire to compete. And why are you competing? Well, it's to get honor. And so the primary way to get honor is through show of force, hand-to-hand combat against another elite warrior. And so this was the world that these aristocrats inhabited. Now, besides this push toward poetry, other things were happening. Greece was entering the early Iron Age. And so iron weapons were becoming more prevalent. Tools were becoming more prevalent. And it was becoming easier and easier to arm more and more of the population, as we've seen. Aside from this, the Greeks also began to adopt the Phoenician alphabet. And this meant that literacy was going to make a comeback in Greece. And so by the end of the Dark Ages, things are beginning to turn around. Things are more settled. The age of migrations and sea people attacks is coming to an end. And life is beginning to settle down. And so as this happens, we enter into our next stage. This next age of Greek history was going to be a very important, informative period of Greek history, which is called the Archaic Age. And it's out of this age that one of the most important Greek developments occurs, and this is the polis. Now, all a polis is a city-state. As some of this Bronze Age technology began to proliferate into the population, Iron Age technology began to proliferate, these tools. As the migration settled down and things became more settled, the population began to make a comeback. And those scattered communities of the Dark Ages began to consolidate into these cities, or a lot of them are probably more like towns. They don't have to be particularly large. Many of them weren't, but some are. Now, a big part of the polis is the idea of citizenship. Members of the polis were expected to participate in its defense. So if it were attacked by another group, you would be expected to take up arms and defend your city. You'd also be expected to participate in law courts and in the town's politics. And so these Greek cities are going to make pretty high demands on the people that live there. You've really got to be an active participant in it. And these Greek cities, though maybe they look a little bit like a Bronze Age palace, they're actually quite different. True, they both have walls, but it's different because it isn't part of this redistributive economy that we saw in the Dark Ages. These citizens who live in this city are going to own their own farms, they're going to own their own land, and the fact that they're landowners is going to be tied to their ability to participate. And so we can think of the polis as a collective of landholders. Now, closely tied with the rise of the polis is the rise of a new form of warrior. And this warrior is called the hoplite. He's distinguished by his heavy armor. As the Iron Age proliferated, more and more citizens were capable of affording the somewhat substantial cost of arming themselves. And so the hoplite is this heavily armed infantryman with his round shield and his roughly 6-foot thrusting spear. Now, on his own, he would be pretty vulnerable. But the Greeks also pioneered a new tactical formation called the phalanx. And in the phalanx, an individual would line up and hold his shield in his left hand. And it may be difficult to picture this, but your shield is only going to cover part of your body. It's going to cover the left part of your body, which would leave the right part of your body exposed, except that you have a neighbor who is going to cover your right side, and also part of his left side. And so this type of formation was going to prove to be incredibly effective, but it required a lot of teamwork, it required a lot of coordination, and it required trusting the people on the side of you. And I don't think it's coincidental that this group form of protection formed around the same time that people were beginning to live in cities and operate in groups together. And so it's very much distinguished from the Dark Age form of warfare on the right here. In this form of warfare, what you have is you have two elite warriors who engage in individual combat. It was considered more manly to do it that way. But as we get into the Archaic Age, the phalanx is a different way of fighting. And so the phalanx is intimately tied to the polis because it's going to be an army of these land-owning citizens. Now, these aren't dirt poor people, but these aren't elite aristocrats either. And people's status will come now, not so much because of birth or any sort of elite notoriety, but your status is going to become based on your participation in collective government, your participation in the city-state. And as the polis becomes more and more important to the defense of the city, it's going to begin to erode the aristocratic domination. At this point, in polises, aristocrats are still the dominant figures. But as the polis begins to, as the phalanx becomes more and more important, this is going to tip the balance of power. And the idea that those who fight should have an equal voice in government will become an important part of the Greek identity. Now, aside from defense, the polis was also a place where people would congregate and meet together. And this was particularly in the agora, which was the central marketplace. This is where people would often meet. They would not only buy things, but they would engage in debate. Politics would sometimes be conducted right in the middle of the marketplace. And so the point I'm trying to get across here is that these polises invested in their centers weren't in private residences, but in public spaces. And this stands in stark contrast to any of the Middle Eastern cities that we've seen, or even the cities of the Bronze Age Greece, where the palace was clearly the center. These cities are also going to have a lot of shared rituals. And so there will be a community temple. And again, Greece never develops a powerful priesthood. As a matter of fact, it's usually just a private citizen who acts as a priest temporarily. And so these festivals will occur at temples. There will also be community festivals. So the idea that I'm trying to get across is that a polis is a place where community gets together. It's also during this time, by the way, that the Olympics begin to emerge. The first Olympiad is held in 776 BC. And if you look at a lot of the track and field, you'll notice that they're basically the skills that you would need in warfare, particularly Dark Age warfare, right? Like how fast you can run, how far you can throw a javelin, Can you throw an opponent to the ground? And so this was kind of a way to take that competitive impulse and this desire to be awesome and to civilize it to some degree. And also to turn it towards civic pride, because obviously it was a great honor for your city to produce an Olympic athlete. Another big trend during this time is the move toward colonization. And so Greek colonization is a little different than probably what you think of when you think of colonization. Basically, what happens in Greece is Greece suffers from overpopulation. As I said, there's not a lot of arable land, and as the population makes a rebound, pretty soon there are communities that can't feed everybody that they have, and so they end up exporting a lot of their population. First, they'll settle the islands of the Aegean, then the coast of Asia Minor. Many settle in the Black Sea, the coast of North Africa. A big Greek population develops in southern Italy and Sicily here, and even as far away as France and Spain. Pretty much everywhere the Phoenicians aren't, you'll find Greek colonists. So between the two of them, they colonize much of the Mediterranean. And this is an important development because it begins to export Greek culture out. And also because many of these places, like take the Black Sea, has great farmland, but is cold, and other places will have mineral wealth. This really stimulates trade, as if you live up in the cold, what would be now southern Ukraine, maybe you don't have access to olives and wine anymore, but you do have grain, and so you'll trade with the Greek mainland. And so it's a period of time where Greek trade really proliferates. Now, the Archaic Age was a time of really experimentation and political development. Coming out of the Dark Ages, most policies weren't particularly equal. Many policies were dominated by aristocratic oligarchies. So aristocrats are just the descendants of those elite warriors who would have more land, status, maybe name recognition. And an oligarchy is a form of government where a small clique, a small few rule. And oftentimes these aristocrats would dominate the politics of these early policies. They would have some sort of a council, and only the elites were welcome there. But as the Archaic Age develops, increasingly there was growing social and economic pressure. Now, on the economic side, a lot of this had to do with the issue of overpopulation and wealth inequality. In many policies, this small elite would lend out money, or they would lend out resources at interest. And so many of the people, especially lower class farmers, found themselves falling into debt bondage. The middle classes, maybe those landowners that have slightly more land, were also unhappy though. Many of these people had the armor to fight in the military as hoplites and defend the city, but they felt that they were shut out of power. And so the aristocrats were increasingly hated by people on the lower end of the spectrum. And this set up a crisis that would result in reforms in many Greek city-states. Now, the first one I want to talk about is Sparta, because Sparta is a bit of a unique situation. Like many Greek city-states, Sparta had land issues, too many mouths to feed and not enough land. And whereas some Greek city-states would export their population, or eventually would trade like Athens would do, in the case of Sparta, they had a different solution. They launched a series of wars against their neighbors, the Messenians. And they pretty much turned the Messenians into serfs. In other words, they forced the Messenians to work for them. This proved to be a bit difficult for the Spartans, though, because they were heavily outnumbered by the Messenians. And so this forced the Spartans to engage in a radical program. Essentially, what the Spartans did is they created this very militarized society. Every Spartan male, now freed from having to do manual labor, had to train continuously to be a warrior, because Sparta felt so threatened by the threat of a serf or slave uprising that they had to essentially turn their society into a very militarized society. Paradoxically, the Spartans called each other equals, because in some ways it was the most equal society, at least if you were a Spartan. But obviously the society rested on slave labor. Now, to keep this society very disciplined and well organized, Sparta became an oligarchy. Not an oligarchy of aristocrats, though, but an oligarchy where only the old held real power. Okay? This, if you want to know the fancy word, this is called a gerontocracy, ruled by the old. And so the Spartans believed that by having old men in power, they would better discipline the society. In other words, they'd be less likely to be captured by newer ideas. Now, all Spartans did get to participate in the assembly, but the real power was in this small group of older, seasoned Spartans. And so Sparta was a society with very rigid military discipline, absolutely elite warriors, but very little individual freedom. Well ordered, but very unfree. And this was going to contrast sharply with Athens. Now, the Archaic Age saw trouble in Athens as well. As I mentioned just a moment ago, many Athenians found themselves in this situation where they were falling into debt bondage. The wealthy would lend out money at interest to poor farmers. They wouldn't be able to pay back, and so they'd find them and their families falling into debt slavery. The Athenian middle class was dissatisfied as well, as we've said. As members of the hoplite class, they resented their second-class status. And so Athens threatened to, fall into a state of anarchy. The Greek word is stasis. Stasis is when a city-state devolves into factionalism. And so it's at this time that Athens began to see its first tyrants emerge. Now, tyrant sounds like a bad word, and it kind of is in modern English, but it wasn't necessarily bad in ancient Athens. At least not for the tyrant. So essentially what happened is as the more and more people fell into debt slavery and as the middle class became more and more dissatisfied, occasionally an aristocrat would become a traitor to his class. In other words, he would assume power by betraying the other aristocrats and setting himself up as like a type of king over the middle and lower classes and become popular in that way. It was, basically like populism. And under the tyrants, a lot of these land reforms were introduced. Tyrants tended to be popular because they engaged in public works. They relieved, excuse me, debt bondage, and they helped to weaken the aristocracy. Now, they weren't always great, and they definitely ruled autocratically, and so they never lasted more than a generation or two. But they were an important stage in the development of democracy. And democracy in Athens developed slowly. We won't go into all the details. It first started under Solon in 594, who abolished debt slavery, essentially guaranteeing that each Athenian would have full civil rights. You couldn't enslave a fellow Athenian. Now, you could enslave somebody else, but not an Athenian. And the big development was under another man by the name of Cleisthenes in 508. And this was the big turning point. Because it was under Cleisthenes that political participation was really expanded to all free citizens of Athens. And he created basically two councils. One was the Council of 500. This is where laws would be written and developed, and then a popular assembly. And this popular assembly would be made up of all Athenian citizens. And they would vote essentially on the proposals of the Council of 500. So you kind of have this like two-step system where a smaller group would write the laws and then a larger group would vote on them. Now, Cleisthenes was so concerned that aristocrats would find a way to wheedle their way in that he made participation in the Council of 500, the ones who would make the law, completely by lot. So random selection. You might be randomly selected to be part of government. Now, probably in our day and age, many people would turn down the offer. But remember, in ancient Athens, this was considered not only an honor, but also a duty. And, once you served, your name was put off to the side for a while. And so in ancient Athens, almost every citizen at some point in their life would serve on an important council. Now, it's important to remember that when we talk about citizens, we are really talking about a relatively select group, even if it did include all landowners. Remember, citizenship was closely tied to one's ability to fight in the military, and so this excluded women. It also excluded Athens' slave population. Now again, these are foreign slaves, not Athenian slaves. And also anyone who was foreign born. And so while we're talking very broad popular participation by ancient standards, we are talking about relatively narrow by our own standards. But it was still an incredible leap. Athens was a city where the average citizen, where the citizens themselves determined what their laws were like, how they would live, how they would act, how they would be governed. They created their own lives. And this stands in stark contrast to what we've seen in the Middle East, where either a king or a god or a priest would come and bestow law and tell people how to live. The Athenians managed their own affairs and decided their own fate. They determined how they wanted to live. Okay, so some of the key themes that we've looked at in this lecture is the transition from this fragmented warrior society during the Archaic Age and the development of city-states. We saw at first politics could be messy. But we saw that because the city-state blended not only politics, but military developments like the hoplite, that it began to shift from aristocratic domination to broader citizen participation. Now, looking forward, we are going to turn to Greece's greatest age, the Classical Age. In our next lecture, we're going to build off the foundations that we've developed here, and we're going to see the rise of Sparta and Athens to become the dominant powers in the Greek world. We're going to see Greece face its first major foreign incursion during the Persian Wars. And we'll see that this challenge to Greek identity tests the Greeks, and they come out stronger on the other side. And it's going to be during this period after the Persian Wars that Greek culture will reach its heights of democracy, culture, but also internal conflict. So I will see you in our next lecture as we begin to look at classical Greece.